Mask mandates. Oh, how we missed you. They're back. Unless, of course, you're the Democrats' favorite president turning 60. Then it's mask off and party time, right? Wilkow starts now. Welcome to the program. I'm Andrew Wilkow. Lockdowns and mandates have absolutely nothing to do with public health and everything to do with government power. The truth is, the federal government doesn't have the power to make anyone wear a mask or take a vaccine. And that's the point. It doesn't matter, though. Here's Biden's so-called COVID czar, Jeffrey Zients.
But in addition to incentives, it's time to impose some requirements based on the realities of different risks unvaccinated individuals pose versus those who have been vaccinated.
Just for the record, he's not a doctor, but follow the Zients. There's also a pattern emerging between January 6th and the so-called public health crisis. I'll explain that in just a bit. But Democrats do not, I repeat, do not believe in democracy. Excuse me, you say? It's in their name. The left believes in democracy as an aesthetic. If you took away the ability of the government to engage in wealth redistribution, the left would die a miserable death in this country, politically speaking. Every crisis is now met with two things: a new restriction and a new spending program, one to quiet the other. The last round of lockdowns turned out to be horribly unpopular. But what does give the Democrats a boost? Paying people not to work. Take this headline: stimulus checks. Could payments turn into monthly guaranteed income? Progressive Democrat lawmakers proposed legislation on Friday that would issue recurring stimulus checks or guaranteed income with monthly payments of up to $1,200 for adults and $600 for children. Mask mandates are back, and millions of people will accept every restriction on freedom as long as they get a check. Democrats are corrupting millions and millions of people to let the left make permanent changes to our way of life that will haunt us for generations if we do not reject them here and now. No, I'm not talking about violent revolution. Panic-based lockdowns are going to be a new normal, and your overlords do not have the time or the patience to deal with your petty concerns. Follow the science now means do as we say or else, even when what they are saying is not actually rooted in science. Headline: CDC finally releases data behind mask guidance U-turn. Study claims vaccinated people infected with Delta variant have same viral levels as the unvaccinated, but only 4 of the 346 sick were hospitalized and none died. Quote, in a report published on Friday, the Federal Health Agency detailed a COVID-19 outbreak early this month in Barnstable County, Massachusetts, linked to the spread of the Indian Delta variant. Researchers found nearly 3/4 of the infections occurred in people who were fully vaccinated against COVID-19 with either of the 3 shots approved by the U.S. for emergency use. However, there were just 4 hospitalizations and no fatalities among the fully vaccinated group. 4 people. 4. That's the reason to impose new mask mandates. It's like the Democrat elites are looking for any flimsy excuse to start another lockdown. Just ask Representative Dan Crenshaw.
Yeah, so we had our staff go through the CDC's website and see what they were citing to justify the new mask mandate. And it turns out they're citing a single study from India. And that study, by the way, is assessing a vaccine that isn't approved in the U.S. It's assessing the AstraZeneca vaccine. We dug a little further, and it turns out that study was also rejected in peer review. They changed the status of rejection to revise the day of the CDC's announcement. So this is extremely suspicious. So you've got a single study, not from our country, not with a vaccine that we even use. It gets worse than that. So the CDC and the administration keep saying they're going to come out with other studies. Well, behind closed doors, they've told reporters they have no such data. They have no other studies at all. Yeah, we have that on the record. Stat reported that.
As I've said all along, if you want to wear a mask, wear one. If you and your trusted doctor feel comfortable enough to take the vaccine, take it without shame. If you and your doctor do not feel comfortable enough, maybe based on your risk of side effects, then don't take the vaccine without shame. You know, we used to say things like, it's a free country. Not anymore.
I'm all for mandating it. But I know here in this country it's tough to mandate things. But I think what we can do, as Dr. Shaw said, is say, look, if you want the independence to make your own decision, fine. But we're not going to let you come to major sporting events or schools. And you've seen many of the universities are now requiring vaccines when students come back on campus. And so we're balancing our rights of freedom with public health.
Just who the heck are these we she's talking about? The Democrats and the media are going to war with anyone who places their God-given and constitutional freedoms above the demand to submit to the rule of so-called experts, because it's not science. It's about the power of the left. The Biden administration is attempting to crack down on misinformation, unless, of course, the government's behind it.
People should not be walking around with masks.
Let me just state for the record that masks are not theater.
Wearing a mask might make people feel a little bit better. And
Masks are protective.
but it's not providing the perfect protection that people think that it is.
Mark, there has not been any indication that putting a mask on and wearing a mask for a considerable period of time has any deleterious effects.
There are unintended consequences. People keep fiddling with the mask and they keep touching their face.
And can you get some schmutz sort of staying inside there?
Of course.
You do not need to wear a mask indoors if, in fact, you've been vaccinated. Good that you're vaccinated, but in a situation where you have people indoors, particularly crowded, you should wear a mask.
So even if you are vaccinated, you should wear a mask.
That if, in fact, you are vaccinated, fully vaccinated, you are protected, and you do not need to wear a mask outdoors or indoors.
When the children go out into the community, you want them to continue to wear masks.
You know, if you look at children outside, particularly when they're with the family, walking down the street, playing a game or what have you, don't have to wear a mask.
The pediatric, the Academy of Pediatric actually makes that recommendation that children should be wearing masks from 2 years old onward.
And you're asking now, if your child is a member of your household, can you walk outdoors with your child without a mask? According to that chart, the answer is yes.
But the child can't, not to beat it to death.
Yes, yes.
Okay. Because now the CDC says, I mean, I think I've got this right. 1 mask is better than 0 masks. 2 masks is better than 1 mask. But you don't have to have double masks. Is that right? I mean,
you know, it became clear that cloth coverings that you didn't have to buy in a store, that you could make yourself, were adequate.
And then you want it to fit better. So one of the ways you could do it, if you would like to, is put a cloth mask over, which actually here and here and here, where you could get leakage in, is much better contained.
are you a double masker, Dr. Fauci? It looked like you are.
All right, that was a lot. But at this point, Fauci would be comical in his lack of credibility, but now the media will hang on every word he utters as the new gospel. Then they regurgitate it.
You've got to start telling people, if you don't get vaccinated, you can't come into this office or this place of business. If you don't get vaccinated, you can't come to work. If you don't get vaccinated, you can't come into this gym. If you don't get vaccinated, you can't come into this, get onto this airplane. It has nothing to do with freedom. It has nothing to do with liberty. You don't have the freedom and the liberty to put other people in jeopardy.
That's the guy President Biden called the most informed journalist in America. CNN has become a literal propaganda arm of the Democratic Party's hard left. And you know what? They don't even want to see people in Cuba complain about the communist tyranny they've been living with for over 62 years either.
I'm Patrick Ottman in Havana, where COVID cases and deaths have surged here despite the Cuban government's claims that they've done a good job handling the pandemic. Certainly it does not help that the historic protests and pro-government demonstrations have taken place over the last few weeks. The government has actually arrested some protesters saying that they violated COVID protocols, but then held their own large pro-government demonstrations to show that the support of the people is still with them. The government is vaccinating here with their own vaccines, but it will likely be weeks or months more before we see a dip in the COVID numbers.
Yeah, stop dithering with this freedom talk stuff and just stay home, do as you're told. Oh, and follow the voice on the loudspeaker. You are about to see the full and ugly truth about the left in this country. And I'm not talking about your cousin or neighbor who voted for Biden. If you have a cousin or neighbor who did vote for Biden, maybe a coworker, I don't know. But that's not the left. The left, for the purpose of this episode, are the people who think you and I are just the nameless, faceless mass of humanity, the people. The technocrats on the left, or as I often like to call them, the academic Democrats, have had enough of your freedom talk. They think freedom versus their alleged expertise is overrated. For generations, hard left thinkers have wanted an economic reset, a reboot, if you will. Now, I don't think I need to do a remedial talk on the Cloward-Piven strategy, but we can trace the lockdowns of today back to 1966, when Cloward and Piven created their strategy to foment political crisis to achieve a guaranteed annual income that was published in the left-wing publication The Nation and then updated by Cloward and Piven back in 2010. They have been selling this to millions of people who have been convinced they are victims, and this will bring about justice, social justice. The pandemic has not only given the hard left a perfect opportunity to recast the economy, but so did January 6th. What? Yes. All left-wing philosophies require an enemy, a target, an alleged oppressive class, even when the intent is to in fact create an oppressive class, i.e. the rule of unelected technocrats. Past enemies have included the rich, capitalists, big corporations, the oil industry, big pharma, and most recently, big tech, many of which, outside the oil industry, have been co-opted by the left. After years of Black Lives Matter organizing, talk of equity, critical race theory, and all that. But now the new enemy is white male conservatives and MAGA hats. The media did a really good job of playing down the BLM Antifa riots, and an even better job of making every single guy who looks and thinks like me into these guys. Here is taxpayer-subsidized PBS correspondent Yamiche Alcindor.
They're largely Republicans, largely white male conservative voters who are looking at these guidance and thinking that there's some sort of conspiracy against their freedoms. The original sin of this pandemic, from a government standpoint, was politicizing it. It was this idea that President Biden's predecessor, former President Trump, that he politicized the idea of wearing masks, that he floated all sorts of issues when it came to what could actually treat the coronavirus. And then finally, when the vaccine that he had been pushing scientists to develop, when it was finally ready, he didn't do the real work of trying to convince his supporters to get vaccinated and left states flat-footed when it came to how to distribute that vaccine. So, of course, the Biden administration now is having to contend with the idea that they're having to tell vaccinated people that they told, if you follow the rules, you'll be able to get this great thing in July, which is a sense of normalcy and your mask off. That is all now being reversed. You can see it when you talk to sources at the White House here. When I talk to sources at the White House, you can hear the frustration in their voices, the concern in their voices, because we are now nowhere near where the president wanted to be in this part of the summer.
She made up almost all that garbage, but we got it. White men in MAGA hats. That's the new enemy. More from CNN. Watch as Harry Enton does his best spastic Steve Kornacki impression.
Look at this. Among whites, look at the partisan divide. White Democrats, 93% of white Democratic adults have been vaccinated versus just about 54% of white Republicans. This gap is about nearly as large as the gap is by age. And right now we're seeing this large partisan divide.
See? There's just one huge problem here. Mr. Enton reported something completely different not that long ago on CNN's website. It's a bit long, but here we go. Quote, a lot of attention has been spent on Republicans being the problem, leading to calls for former President Donald Trump to address the group. A look at the data reveals that the vaccine hesitant group, however, are not big Trump lovers. They're likely actually not to be Republicans. Instead, many of them are people who are detached from the political process and didn't vote for either major candidate in 2020. The most recent Kaiser poll helps illustrate that the vaccine hesitant group doesn't really lean Republican. Just 20% of the group call themselves Republican, with an additional 19% being independents who lean Republican. The clear majority, 61%, were not Republicans. 41% said they were Democrats or Democrat-leaning independents, and 20% were either pure independents or undesignated. This is very much unlike the vaccine-resistant group, of whom 55% are Republican or Republican-leaning independents. Just 21% of that group are Democrats or Democrat-leaning independents. Okay. Hesitant versus resistant. It sounds like a nuance without a distinction, but it doesn't really matter. They've created their enemy and their narrative, and they're going to run with it. Are we supposed to believe that only white male conservatives have concerns about freedom in the future? What happens when follow the science runs into left-wing woke politics? Al Hunt hosts Politics War Room with James Carville. Here's his byline over at The Hill. Freedom-loving conservatives stoked latest round of infection and death. There are a few unvaccinated for religious reasons and people of color who have historical reasons to distrust public health workers and the CDC, but chiefly the vaccination failure is because coronavirus has been politicized among conservatives, with right-wing politicians, judges, think tanks, and activists charging it's all about personal liberty. This ignores the fact that exercising those personal liberties risks the liberties and lives of others. So the science goes out the window when dealing with people of color. That doesn't sound very scientific now, does it? Same thing at the border. Here's Representative Chip Roy pointing out that there is no concern for the fact that illegals infected with COVID and perhaps the Delta variant are crossing into the United States and being dispersed into the interior by the Biden administration.
What we're seeing at the border is an absolute travesty. And yet my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are going to do nothing, literally nothing about that today, even as we see people spilling across the border who are clearly testing positive for COVID. We have a hotel in La Jolla, Texas that is literally filled right now with individuals who are heavily testing positive for COVID. These are the facts on the ground. And I know my friend, the speaker, knows how bad it is at the border, knows how bad it is in Laredo, knows how bad it is in Del Rio, knows how bad it is in McAllen. I've got a text here from a sheriff in a small Texas town saying, we're passing an emergency declaration tonight at City Council that no illegal immigrants can be released in the city of Uvalde per the CDC guidelines of countries on their list without a negative COVID test, and we have had our health authority write orders that give us the authority to have them government, Border Patrol, and immigrant quarantine for 10 to 14 days. We have a crisis at our border, and we're playing footsie with mask mandates in the people's house. I mean, it's absolutely absurd what this body is doing, the people's house. It's an embarrassment. It's a mockery. And the American people are fed up. They want to go back to life. They want to go back to business. They want to go back to school without their children being forced to wear masks.
Who cares, right? Science. The media is ginning up this idea that white men in MAGA hats pose the greatest security risk we face. To believe that, you would have to ignore the past almost 2 years of unending political violence from the left and the crime rate that is spiraling out of control in the Democrat-run cities. The Democrats' mouthpieces are constantly screaming in the faces of non-white voters that their rights are under attack while they are attacking said rights. Oh, you want to talk freedom? You want to hear what a white guy in a MAGA has to say? Listen to hip-hop legend Busta Rhymes.
In the last 15 months, COVID could suck a we outside. All these little weird Government policies and mandates sucker.
I don't remember seeing him around the Donald Trump rallies. This racial divide is being stoked with purpose. But when lockdowns are imposed, when rights get trampled, does anyone think that only white men in MAGA hats are going to be staring out from the cage? Notice how quickly the elite went from "we don't trust Trump" to "take the vaccine now," and they're done being nice about it.
We're going to do a major vaccination drive for kids 12 years old and up. And look, I'm a parent. My kids went to New York City public schools. If my kids were going to school in September, I would be running to get them vaccinated right now. And like was said a moment ago, we used to do this as parents all the time for a variety of vaccinations. We've got to shake people at this point and say, come on now. We tried voluntary. We could not have been more kind and compassionate as a country. Free testing everywhere you turn, incentives, friendly, warm embrace. The voluntary phase is over. We can keep doing those things. I'm not saying shut it down. I'm saying voluntary alone doesn't work. It's time for mandates because it's the only way to protect our people.
Maybe that should be a new bumper sticker. Socialism. We tried to be nice. There is no law to enforce without legislation. If we are going to be ruled by unelected experts, then why do we even need elected legislatures? Try to imagine the control over the individual the federal government would have during the next COVID lockdown if there was single-payer health care. Now, around here, we don't like the idea of making Nazi references, but headline: unvaccinated players on 2 NFL teams to wear yellow wristbands at practice to distinguish them from vaccinated players. So here's the argument. It's neither selfish nor ignorant to continue to place civil rights and liberty above the rule of technocrats. Notice the people who scream "follow the science" never follow the science when the cameras are turned off. Like former President Obama's recent birthday party extravaganza. Hundreds of celebrities flown in, crammed under a tent to dance and party while maskless. And those hundreds of guests who arrived, they made the cut after Obama promised to scale down by only inviting close friends and family members. What happens today will affect the future. Just because a supposed elite ruling class is done having their plans challenged doesn't mean we must now bow down to them. Public, aka government guidelines and best practices, are good things. I'm not going to say they're not. But they aren't laws, and they can't be enforced by police or courts. And no, vaccines are not bad things. I'm not going to say that either. But they cannot be forced upon us. The idea that unelected or even elected people taking cues from unelected people can potentially turn the whole of the nation into one giant internment camp is something we must reject. Notice how the smart people aren't thinking or even discussing what the future would look like if we allow our freedoms to be strangled anytime one of our overlords wants to hit the big red button. Our freedoms are like a sandcastle. They're delicate. A sandcastle could take hours to build and seconds to destroy. Liberty's no different. Once we give up a freedom, it will be near impossible to regain. When they say follow the science, we must say follow the history. For the record, I love science. It's the search for absolutes. But no society can remain free if technocrats can simply declare that our rights are null and void. The people who are making this about race and politics are the ones doing a disservice and the ones putting our society at risk. When they say we're all in this together, they have no plans to join you in detention. If we're going to line up and take a jab, let it be a shot of freedom. All right, joining me now is fellow BlazeTV host and author of the new book, The Faucian Bargain, Steve Dace. How you doing?
Good to see you, Andrew. How you been?
Pretty good. During the monologue, we literally played a 2-minute, and that's long for a montage in this business, 2-minute montage of Fauci contradicting himself, but follow the science, right?
Yeah, I mean, you could. There are volumes of contradictions from Anthony Fauci, and You know, I said this to my audience the other day, Andrew. What bothers me the most about this, because I hear from people all the time, you know, I pointed out he told just a flat out lie over the weekend that we're seeing an explosion, explosion of children being hospitalized with COVID. I just hopped on the CDC's own database and found that last week, 1.8% of all COVID hospitalizations in America, 1.8 were children of school aged. That's actually 112% lower than it was when the school year ended. Never at any point in the pandemic has the number been above 3.4%. He does stuff like this all the time. He's never fact checked. And so people always push back on me and like, well, you think you know more than Anthony Fauci. Well, first of all, this is their data. I don't know how to accumulate the data. I'm citing their data. But secondly, it's the fact, Andrew, that I know I don't know more than him. That's what bothers me. How is it possible that we wrote a best-selling #1 book, and I'm a community college graduate, debunking America's leading epidemiologist and immunologist? That should not happen, and it's only occurred because the guy has told so many provable lies.
Let me go over to Dr. Rochelle Wolinski, the director of the CDC. The Florida Department of Health had to go on Twitter and correct the CDC, who made the claim that there were approximately 30,000 new cases in Florida in one day. They said, no, hold on a second here. You're taking 3 days approximately and putting them together. They were off by almost 50%. But by the time the Florida Department of Health had gone on Twitter, on social media to correct this, the media was pounding Ron DeSantis. The hospitals are overflowing. The children are going in. They're on ventilators. It's a death wave. He's the Grim Reaper. Oh, wait, we're off by 50%.
Since the beginning of the pandemic, Florida, with the third largest population in the country, one of the largest elderly populations in the country, it ranks 26th, Andrew, 26th in death rate per million, according by COVID. 26th. New York, by the way, still ranks second. You want to talk about a case explosion? Let's talk about New York, which is one of the more vaccinated states in the country. In the last 60 days, Andrew, cases in New York have exploded 522%. 522% between June 9th and August 9th. So when you look at how far more open Florida is, keep in mind also with the New York explosion, Andrew, it's not in their season. You know, this has all followed a respiratory virus longitudinal season, the whole way through from the beginning of the pandemic. So if you live in the Northeast, which of course is a part of the country I know you're familiar with, your peak season is late winter, early spring. We're way past that, and still cases are exploding in New York State. This is the same Sunbelt wave that we had, seasonal wave, at this time last year when Texas was having stupid outdoor mask mandates. It's followed the same pattern both years in a row. And when you look at the numbers, Florida has outperformed New York by any reasonable standard, despite being a far more open state. But again, that's because there's a certain narrative that they want to promote within the media. And right now, Ron DeSantis is John Travolta and Get Shorty, brother. Okay, I mean, their #1 goal, they have to get rid of him. They cannot allow, my state of Iowa has kind of been a Sweden since last May. Georgia has been, South Dakota has been, but they can just kind of memory hole a bunch of those states. They can't memory hole the most expensive swing state in the country, in Florida. They can't do that. They can't have a guy like DeSantis basically turning turning Florida into a Sweden level control group. So they need to discredit him at all costs.
The monologue of this episode was about how this has now moved into the rule of technocrats, right? Fauci's been wrong. Wolinski's been wrong. Biden first said, don't trust the vaccine because of Trump. Now he's demanding trust it because of me, even though it's the same vaccine. They're saying, but it's a crisis. You guys have to give up on your God-given constitutional rights because it's a crisis. Well, the mayor of Chicago says white supremacy is a crisis. You've got John Kerry who says climate change is a crisis. I mean, what constitutes a crisis at this point? Whenever the overlords say, we now have a crisis, do as we say, follow the voice on the intercom, and don't question.
Yes. The current case fatality rate for COVID in America is 0.59%. We have not been over 1,000 daily deaths with COVID in America, and that's before we even start filtering through, okay, but, how many comorbidities, the average age. The average COVID death in America is 2.1 comorbidities and 79 years old, which is a year older, by the way, than the average lifespan in America. The current case fatality rate is 0.59%. It is currently the eighth most likely way that you will die today, ranking
let me just jump in with
say.
something here. Let me just jump in. Look, the raw numbers, we can't. I mean, the raw numbers are nothing to downplay, right? Thousands and thousands of people have died. Hundreds of thousands of people have died. Families have been without those people, whether they're old, young, or in the middle. But that's still, look, your numbers are of course spot on. But isn't it amazing, though, that this is leading people to believe that we don't question our overlords, and now we're dividing ourselves, where if you say, well, wait a second, we still retain God-given rights. We still retain the right to say, we'll decide when we're going to take the vaccine. Look, and I'm not against vaccines. Vaccines are good things. Guidelines and safe practices are good things, but they're not laws. And stop treating them like they're laws. Stop telling us that the courts are going to enforce them or the police are going to enforce them. Until the legislative process works, there is no law, and we will not be ruled by unelected technocrats.
That's exactly why the data I was just citing matters, is because what they like to do is take these big whole numbers that do matter. All right, so right now we're in the middle of filming a movie about one of my books. We had to just shut down production in Oklahoma City because both of our directors got serious COVID and one of them was hospitalized. All right. So I know firsthand, I myself had COVID. Those whole numbers do matter when we're talking about our own personal lives and the sacrifices that go on in our families. The data points matter when we get into public policy. So at what point do I get to impose what's going on in my family or the struggles we're having in my business? Do I get to impose them on the American people as a whole? And that's when you do now start looking at the holistic data, Andrew, and it does matter because it just doesn't justify any of this tyranny on any level. The problem we have is twofold. One, there is no objective source now of information that we would all go to and say, hey, they gave us the all clear. Walter Cronkite told us at 6 o'clock tonight on the CBS News, everything's fine, back to normal after the TV dinner's done. We can't do that anymore. So any source we cite, any data we cite, somebody in the other America, and then vice versa, is going to question it. That's a major problem. The other major problem we have, what is a win? Even if we had a source to tell us information we counted as objective, what's a win? Because we originally started this to save the hospital system from being overridden. Since this pandemic began, we've never had more than 9% of ER visits for COVID. Never. Currently, it's under 2%. So, I mean, how much better can it possibly get? Well, then if you cite the serious data or the death numbers that I was citing, 126 days in a row, we've been under 1,000 daily deaths. Then they'll come back with cases.
Yeah, but you could sit there and do that all day. What do you do with people who say we're not going back? Oh, no. We're never going back. It doesn't matter what happens. You're going to wear a mask when we tell you to. You're going to stay indoors when we tell you to, and shut up about Barack Obama's birthday party, right? They tried to say, well, it was outdoors and it wasn't that many people. It was in a tent and it was hundreds of people. So basically what our overlords are saying is when we push the red button, you will follow orders, and don't worry, there'll be a check for you to keep your mouth shut.
This isn't going to end until we make it end, and not a moment sooner. That's the bottom line. I mean, we have to just refuse to comply. There needs to be mass civil disobedience all over the country. I saw the massive event at that suburban Nashville school district earlier this week. That crowd was great. They were ornery. That's great. But what happens if the school board looks at you guys in the eye over their masks and says, screw you, we're doing it anyway? All of you send your kids to school the first day without a mask. Make them expel you all. They won't be able to do that. See, any form of tyranny, Andrew, is only as good as those willing to comply with it or enforce it. We need to make them enforce these things. Because a lot of those cops and a lot of those local public health officials, those are our neighbors. Do they want to take that level of scrutiny? Do they want to take that level of heat? I think it's time that we find out. We're going to have to learn what the term civil disobedience means, and we're going to have to get comfortable being uncomfortable.
Well, the truth is, again, you're not breaking any laws because these aren't laws. Isn't it funny? And I got a wrap here. The Democrats went from resist to obey. Right?
Right. Yes. And, you know, they looked from man to pig and pig to man and back to pig again, Andrew, and they couldn't tell the difference. Yes.
All right, Steve Dace, thank you so much for joining us again. We'll talk to you soon.
You bet, brother. Take care.
On a side note, you want to see some follow the science theater? Cue up Peter Doocy and Jen Psaki.
As the president tries to reach unvaccinated Americans, has there been any thought given, looking back, to the possibility that he may have created some vaccine hesitancy when last year, around this time, the previous administration was rushing to get a vaccine authorized, and the now president said, I trust vaccines, I trust scientists, but I don't trust Donald Trump, and at this moment, the American people can't either.
Well, I think it's safe to say he still doesn't trust Donald Trump, so that hasn't changed. But he does trust scientists, he does trust data experts, and he does trust the people leading the CDC, the FDA, which is the gold standard of approval for vaccines. I'd also note, because this question often comes up, that the president has repeatedly given credit to scientists and experts from the prior administration, even as recently as just a few weeks ago, for their role in moving the vaccine forward.
Yes, but at the time when Donald Trump is out there saying we're going to have a vaccine in the next couple of weeks, next couple of months, and Joe Biden is out on the campaign trail saying don't trust Donald Trump, did that create any kind of vaccine hesitancy?
Not that we've seen in the data. I would note that at the time, just for context, the former president was also suggesting people inject versions of poison into their veins to cure COVID. So I think that's a relevant point.
And Joe Biden, then vice president, was saying we got to wait until something is fully authorized, and it's still not.
Well, the FDA works on the timeline of science. At the same time, we've also seen tens of millions of people's lives saved who have gotten the vaccine. That data is clear across the country.
All right, okay, let's try to keep up here. So Jen Psaki says that they still don't trust Trump, who's long out of power, but they do trust the vaccine that was developed under his leadership, but they'll only credit the so-called scientists and experts that were taking cues from Trump. So they went from don't trust Trump to you must trust Biden. It's the same vaccine. Now, I have nothing of value to offer you. So I will offer you nothing of value if you can provide to me, or anyone else for that matter, this tape or clip or transcript of Donald Trump actually suggesting that you inject poison into your body. This is something that's been completely conjured up by the Democrat left of the media. There is no tape, there is no quote, there is no transcript. Okay, you just heard the clip. That was DHS Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas saying, no, we're not bringing people into the interior. Of the over 200,000 people apprehended in July, the only ones that are staying are the small, unaccompanied children. All of the single adults and families, they're all going back. We know none of that's true. Joining us on the program is Chris Cabrera. He is a Border Patrol agent and Vice President of the National Border Patrol Council. Sir, thank you for joining us.
No, thank you for having me.
All right, so the Secretary of Homeland Security says the only people that are coming into the interior and staying are the unaccompanied children. Is that true?
Yeah, that's not true at all. You know, we have some people that are going back that are single adults unless they come from certain countries where they're given temporary protective status. We have families that we're releasing every single day. And I think one of the big things everybody's missing is the amount of people that are just getting away on top of it all.
So is he talking about the people who have been apprehended versus people who've evaded the Border Patrol altogether? Is there a different number here?
Yeah, I mean, there's a big number. I think the agency number is somewhere around 300,000 as far as apprehensions this fiscal year. I think that's a very conservative number. I think we're probably close to 700,000. And then, you know, the people that he says they're sending back, if you come with a kid under a certain age, they're letting you in. If you come from, say, Venezuela or Nicaragua, they're letting you in because they have temporary protective status. So, yeah, nothing could be further from the truth.
What about the backlog at those Border Patrol detention facilities, right? First it was kids in cages when it was President Trump, and then all of a sudden it was not kids in cages, but we did see that they were overfilled and overrun. How did they alleviate that pressure so quickly?
Well, I think that's the $1 million question. What we're looking at now, and nothing can be proven, but it's just amazing when somebody shows up, some bigwig shows up, and it just happens to be that nobody's there in custody. And as soon as they leave, all these bodies just magically appear. They get shipped in on a bus from somewhere. So it's kind of hard to tell, without any proof. But we're sitting on, usually 5,000-10,000 in custody at any given time.
What about the COVID testing? We have seen in McAllen and other communities, the local governments quickly trying to move to make it so that COVID positive migrants are not being released into their communities. But there's a flat denial coming from the administration that people are coming across the border and then making their way into the interior while being positive for COVID.
Yeah, in Border Patrol custody, it's very rare that we test anybody unless they have some type of signs or symptoms, or they have some type of medical necessity where they go to the hospital and then the hospital tests them. And then sometimes we'll quarantine them, or sometimes we just release them. And then the vast majority, probably 90% of the people we don't test, they get tested either by HHS, the Health and Human Services, and then they'll get released, or they get released to Catholic Charities, one of the non-governmental organizations. They test them and then they release them. So, I mean, I think it was 1 week last week, or last month, I believe they released 1,500 people just in this area that were COVID positive. And that's because not everybody gets tested. So you can imagine the amount of people that come through that are positive.
What's the effect been on your coworkers, your brothers, your colleagues? I mean, I have to imagine that so many Border Patrol agents are getting infected.
Yeah, I think we have something around 400 in quarantine right now. Close to 100 that, I could be off on the numbers, but somewhere in there that are actually COVID positive, some of them that have been vaccinated. So we do have a lot of people that are getting sick. A buddy of mine just called me this afternoon that he just tested positive. So it is happening. It's quite rampant in the Border Patrol. For some reason, they're just, if it happens down here, the government's not taking it seriously. I don't understand that.
When the administration says they are, in fact, quickly repatriating people, does that mean they've been given some level of due process? Their asylum claim is rejected and they're put on a plane or a bus? What's the process from apprehension to repatriation?
If they're a single adult, they don't have any family with them, we'll repatriate them back to Mexico. Usually it takes a couple of hours. They do a tiny bit of paperwork, and then we walk them right back across the bridge. And most likely they'll try again tomorrow. But if you're soft on the immigration, if you're not stringent on the repercussions for crossing illegally, of course they're going to continue trying. It's just like a little kid. You tell them don't touch it, and they touch it, and you don't do anything. They're going to continue. And we've been soft with it ever since this new administration came in. They've been very touchy-feely, very hands-off, and we're starting to see the effects of it.
This might sound like a completely stupid question. You and I have talked about this before. Where are the Mexican border authorities when this is all going on? I mean, do they have any law enforcement or military involved in Border Patrol on their northern border? Or is it just wide open until they come into contact with the U.S. Border Patrol?
We never see them. Coincidentally, last year when the Remain in Mexico policy went into play, you would see Mexican military all over their northern border, our southern border. You would see them all the time deterring people, not letting people even cross. And now all of a sudden they're just nowhere to be found. So the smugglers come in. Smugglers don't even make landfall anymore. They just touch the raft up to the bank and tell them to go find somebody in a green shirt. And they come look for us and turn themselves in. And we're so backed up with people. They're moving smuggling loads in full view of us, knowing that we're too occupied with one agent, two agents writing up 400 people that we can't go after and chase a smuggling load. And they know that they're using it to their advantage, and they're doing quite well.
All right, I'm going to ask you a silly question that I know the answer to, so it's kind of rhetorical. Has Kamala Harris, the vice president, who's been tasked with dealing with the border by the president, been to visit you guys down at the border?
Not at all. It's a shame. That's her thing, and then she's not there, but it's probably a good thing, because most of the people that come down here, they just want a selfie to show that they've been here, and then they go back to Washington and nothing gets done. So,
I look at the Biden administration, and I know this is a different lane for you. They're getting ready to hire 87,000 new IRS agents. We don't need 87,000 new IRS agents. We need new Border Patrol agents. We need more resources down at the border. And look, of even the humane ones, I know it's not just a law enforcement thing when you're dealing with children, but you can't expect law enforcement officers to be diaper-changing nannies. That's not your job. So I don't know if you could tell me, but how many people do you think you need at this point to stop the flow of migrants?
You know, I think right now, I mean, obviously we can use all we can get because people are retiring at an unprecedented rate. But I think we, you know, right now, if they just let us do our job and you know, get us out of the babysitting business and just with the stroke of a pen, implement the policy, put us back to work, we can do it with what we have. I mean, granted, we could probably use another couple thousand, but if they let us out there and to do our job, we could do it with what we have. Unfortunately, that's not in the cards right now.
Well, the one thing that they have to do, and we're running out of time, we are out of time here, is stop this little game of the parents coming across first, then the kids come across, and then their kids are shipped to them, and then the whole family stays illegally while they're telling us this is all about these little babies and children. We know there's a game being played here, and we're the ones getting played. Chris Cabrera, thank you so much for joining us again.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
All right, we'll get you back soon. All right, time now for parting shots, and today's parting shot is at the Australian government, who's literally putting their military on the streets to enforce a new round of COVID lockdowns. Listen to this nutcase.
We need to limit our movements. We need to consider whenever we leave our house that anyone with us, anyone we come into contact with, could convey the virus. So whilst it is in human nature to engage in conversation with others, to be friendly, unfortunately, this is not the time to do that. So even if you run into your next door neighbour in the shopping centre, in the Coles, whilst you're at Coles or Woolworths or Aldi or any other grocery shop, don't start up a conversation. Now is the time for minimising your interactions with others. Even if you've got a mask, do not think that affords total protection. We want to be absolutely sure that as we go about our daily lives, we do not come into contact with anyone else that would pose a risk.
Okay, clearly she's been kicked in the head one too many times by a kangaroo. So there it is. Board up your windows, lock up your doors, don't talk to anyone. How crazy is that? What are people supposed to do? Stay indoors all day snuggling their koala? Watching Crocodile Dundee on a loop, listening to ACD records, eating their Vegemite sandwiches with a can of Foster's? There's something wrong with you people, and I know what it is. You're upside down. We're right. They're wrong. That's the end of the story. The arguments on this television program cannot be broken. Make sure you catch me on SiriusXM Patriot Channel 125, noon to 3 East, 9 to noon West. From Dallas, Texas, I'm Andrew Wilkow. Thank you for watching Blaze TV.